Hey there, everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. As the title of the stream says, these are further comments on the Hegelian versus the Marxist concept of alienation. Been having a ongoing discussion with somebody who goes by the name of Olaf Olafsson on the comments to that video. I'll link them in the description later. But Olaf made a particular set of points in his latest post response to me, which I thought deserved a live stream response, or rather a live response. So first off, sorry Olaf, you're still wrong about me saying that Marx strives for primitive communality. Yes, I listened back to my own video. Perhaps you should listen back, because I didn't say it. But going on to the rest of the meat of your argument, you quote me saying this, quote, that alienation is necessary as a phase does not change its negative role for Marx. One, he does not see returning in communism, end quote. And he comments, I've just quoted the passage that proves that this claim is wrong. And he's quoting a passage from the 1844 manuscripts. Marx does not claim alienation will be overcome in communism. I'll quote it again here, and I would like you to admit that your claim as to Marx's position is erroneous. I will not continue this discussion. There is no point in arguing about facts. And the relevant quote is this, quote, in the same way atheism, being the supersession of God, is the advent of theoretic humanism, and communism as the supersession of private property is the vindication of real human life as man's possession, and thus the advent of practical humanism. Or, atheism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of religion, whilst communism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of private property. Only through the supersession of this mediation, which is itself, however, a necessary premise, does positively self-deriving humanism, positive humanism, come into being. So some comments on that. Returning back to the quote, Marx says, in the same way atheism, being the supersession of God, is the advent of theoretic humanism. For one, atheism is not the supersession. It is not the sublation of religion. That is bullshit. And if you understand what religion actually is, you know that that's bullshit. Atheism is part of the dialectic, a flat dialectic between theism and atheism, but it is not a unifying higher order state of consciousness. It's not a unifying higher order concept. So no, atheism does not supersede religion. As a matter of fact, it's caught in this very same problem it's trying to solve. And Marx himself actually understands this when he says that, real atheism is not really this typical atheism people talk about. That, for him, what would count as real atheism would precisely be this kind of view which transcends this whole dichotomy of religion and atheism to begin with. So when he says atheism here, he's not using it in the same way that regular people use it, and it does not mean the same thing. And so in that sense, atheism is not a supersession of religion. It's not a supersession of God. He says atheism is the supersession of God, is the advent of theoretic humanism. Sure, that is a necessary movement, but it is not the sublating movement. Unless, of course, you want to get into technicalities of self-sublation, in which every concept, through its immanent self-negation, sublates itself into the other. But this is not normally what you, I, or most people mean when we're talking about sublation, even though technically it does fall within it in a very precise sense. But that's not what we're talking about. So continuing, communism as a supersession of private property is the vindication of real human life as man's possession, and thus the advent of practical humanism. And once again, this idea of supersession, this idea of sublation, I don't think we're talking about the same thing. Sorry to say, Olaf, but I think we're talking past each other here, in which what you think this actually means and what I know this means for Hegel. Now, you may dispute that I know this for Marx, but I'm pretty sure that I know it for Marx as well. I read this stuff that you're quoting at me. Is not the same. And so we're talking past each other in a very big way, in which the way that Marx posits communism is the exact same way he's positing atheism here. that it's not really this transcendent, it's this moving over to the next side of the dialectic. First you have private property, then you don't have private property. And the movement is through the self-negation of one into the other, just like being and nothing shift to each other. But that's not how it works. And that's why I don't agree with Marx. That's why I disagree with Marxism in general, with Marxists, because that's not how it works on the grand scale of things. The movement does happen between one pendulum to another, but then when you're talking about the sublation, it's the return from the two, in which you realize that both of them are necessary. And it's not just necessary in this whole way of like, oh, well, I needed to go through that phase to get to this phase. That's where there is a misunderstanding. That's where, people get this misunderstanding of the philosophy of history as well. So, quoting Marx again, communism as supersession of private property is the vindication of real human life as man's possession, and thus the advent of practical humanism, or atheism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of religion, whilst communism is humanism mediated with itself through the supersession of private property. Only through the supersession of this mediation, which is itself, however, a necessary premise, does positive humanism come into being. And so this has the shape of something that seems to be talking about sublation in the Hegelian sense. But again, I reiterate, this is not talking about sublation in the Hegelian sense. And it's very clear when Marx is talking about the way atheism relates to God, as well as how communism relates to private property or capital, which he identifies both of them. I don't think they should be identified, frankly, because the actual sublation of religion and atheism is something that goes higher. It's not just humanism, and it's not just something like what Feuerbach tried to do, in which he tries to raise humanity to God. That's not it. That's not it in the Hegelian understanding. That's not it in my own comprehension either. I don't agree with that because it doesn't mean the same thing. So, then you quote me and you say that you quote me saying, for Marx, alienation is bad. It's not fixed by sublating, but by getting rid of the source of dialectic. Negate capital through technology, and you negate what it produces as alienation. And Olaf asks, are you trying to tell me that Hegel believes no social relations are ever overcome historically, in historical reality? Social relations are superseded every day in the real world. Surely you know that Hegel is aware of this. And I'm not trying to say that Hegel believes no social relations are ever overcome historically. Clearly moved on from feudalism into capitalism. And clearly we'll eventually move on from capitalism into something else. But when we're talking about sublation, we're not talking about that historical movement of one spot to the next. We're talking about a logical relation of one spot to the next. For example, the movement from feudalism to capitalism is not the same as you would think the movement of capitalism to communism is, because Marx's argument about why we got out of feudalism is just not true, honestly. There's a lot more factors that go into that than mere just technology. It's not just a technological, and it's not just even a class struggle simplification. A lot of things went on with that whole deal. But when you get to capitalism from feudalism, you notice that much of feudalism is left behind. What is left behind is stuff that had no truth, no social truth to begin with. It didn't have a real systematic genesis that could reproduce and maintain itself, within a free relation. But capital is different. Capital actually does. If you have the rules of private property, you already have all that you need for the genesis of capital as such, in which so long as you keep consistent with the rules, you're going to have the generation of this very weird entity we call capital. This whole systematic relation, this whole systematic development, which just left to its own devices. You freely follow the logic. There is no arbitrary positing, such as like I'm the lord and you're the serf, or I'm the slave master and you're just a slave, because those logics don't work. Those logics are illegitimate to begin with. There's nothing true to be taken in of those. For example, if you look at the phenomenology of spirit and you look at the whole master-slave dialectic, so-called, the Lord's and bondsman, The truth of that whole thing is not the fact that one is a master and one is a slave. The truth of that whole thing is actually self-consciousness. It is a movement to self-consciousness. And that's why when you move on from that, it doesn't matter. The master and slave relation is left behind, whether it still is in existence or not. Logically, it's of no interest. Logically, feudalism is of hardly any interest to capitalism. It has most of its social structures are arbitrarily positive, and they just had no reality to begin with. Insofar as they had any reality, they kept on. But capitalism superseded by communism is a whole different beast, because once you know that capital works, because Marx himself worked out the logic imminently, you should understand that it's not a supersession from like feudalism to capitalism. You get to communism and you don't get rid of the bad stuff in capitalism, and then you just keep the good stuff. There is, logically, pretty much a lot of good stuff in capital, which is hard to get rid of if you want to make the claim that you're going to supersede it. So social relations are superseded every day in the real world, at least says Olaf. Surely you know that Hegel is aware of this. Well, of course. But that's not to do with what I'm talking about. He quotes me saying, "For Hegel, no real alienation is ever undone, only brought to light as not absolute and not destructive. And these are not the alienations Marx considers." And Olaf says, "Marx does not believe alienation to be absolute or absolutely destructive, or he would not have bothered trying to figure out how to overcome it. It is historically necessary, but precisely not absolute." You misunderstood me there. When I say that no real alienation is ever undone, only brought to light as not absolute and not destructive, and these are not the alienations considered by Marx considers, I'm talking about the fact that alienation itself is already, in fact, not absolute and not destructive. It is destructive only when we mistake them as absolute. I'm not saying that Marx mistakes them as absolute. I'm saying that Marx does not see them as constitutive in a positive sense, precisely because of what you're going to say later on in this comment. And I'll expand on that when we move along. Olaf quotes me as saying, "For Hegel, we shall always be alienated even in communism, and for Marx, this is not so." Olaf says, again, this is incorrect, and I expect you to admit this in the light of my quotation. Once again, I think we're talking past each other, because we're talking about different alienations here. Insofar as alienation as such, and the only alienation Marx actually cares about is human alienation from human essence, yeah, he does think that's going to end. You're going to go into communism. You're finally going to be reunited with your essential nature as a laborer. You're going to realize yourself in labor, in work, etc., etc. You're going to realize your own community through your own individual labors. Your labor is going to be directly social, etc., etc. And so the alienation is indeed gone. And it's overcome in the sense that the very basis of it is now completely eradicated. We don't have commodity production. We don't have all these other social structures which are producing the alienation to begin with. And therefore, the only supersession that Marx is recognizing is a supersession in which we had so the only alienation which Marx is considering is that is superseded is the alienation that we had as a temporal moment. Like you and I as a person, for example, we get to a certain point in development in which we do certain things in life and we realize, oh, we made a mistake. But, in making that mistake, we learned something. We learned that there were some necessary things, and we learned that there were some unnecessary things. And then we move on, and our life keeps going. And Marx sees history and supersession, sublation, moving. Oh my God! Sorry for this deblurring camera. I don't know why it does it. Nothing I can do apparently. And so Marx considers sublation and alienation to be moving in that kind of way, and it does move in that kind of way to a certain extent. But that is not all the ways in which alienation really moves. There are alienations which are merely structural and universal to the entire human experience, which you will not get rid of, and no matter what you do. For example, I'm willing to completely admit, and even Hegel has this intimation, that eventually we'll get to a certain point of technological development where certain things will just not make sense any longer, though they made sense at lower orders, simply because the very cause for those certain relations, those certain structures, and those certain understandings will just simply not be around. If we get to super productive communism, which is the fantastic dream that all Marxists have, that eventually we'll just produce everything like Star Trek, and there'll be just enough for everybody, and nobody's going to care about property. At that point, indeed, the idea of property in those things will no longer make any sense to us, and we just simply will move on with our lives, not because any state dictates, but because simply it becomes a mere part of our own bygone era. We look at things, we're like, well, why do people care about those things? They're so meaningless to us. Nowadays, people hoard food, waiting for the apocalypse. But, in a good time, people look at that and laugh and say, why would anybody worry about that? That's silly nonsense. There's people who still just lose their minds if you trespass onto their property, even though, they live on acres and acres of land that they're not fucking using. But, oh no, you step on it and they lose their fucking minds. In a future society in which that isn't really an issue, this whole issue of land, property, and ownership and all that crap, it just isn't a problem. Nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to care. That's just simply going to be the fact. And so you'll just move on. It'll be superseded in that way in which, just like how you learn from your first relationship, in romance, in which you make a lot of mistakes and you look back, you're like, wow, that was stupid of me to worry about so much, this and that, and doing all these other things. And then you just move on. But that's a different kind of supersession than what I'm talking about. Sorry, looking at the comments. Meh says, well, didn't Hegel just misunderstand terms like spirit, idea, and absolute? I mean, the whole divide between materialism and idealism is a meme. Spirit does not develop independent of material reality. Oh, he meant Marx, not Hegel. Yeah, Marx misunderstood all those categories. But that's not really here nor there. So, if we're talking about alienation as such, then of course, I think Marx understood it. Even Marx himself says, look, history doesn't end at communism. He thought that history began at communism, that we were in prehistory right now. And depending on which way you're looking at things, we either are or we aren't. But I think Marx's view is rather arbitrary, and therefore I don't care what he has to say about that, interesting or not. But when we're talking about what alienation Marx cares about, which is human alienation, yes, I think he does believe that the essential alienation, which is the alienation from labor, the alienation from our ways of life, is going to end. And as I've read from the 1804 manuscripts, and I read more of it than I actually care, that's what I got from it. And from reading Capital, that's what I got from Marx. Now, is that impossible? Is that bad? Am I saying, oh God, it's like Marx is a fool. He thinks we're going to be, you're going to reach a point in our lives where we're going to not be alienated from our work. We're actually going to enjoy it. We're going to be productive members of society doing things for other people. Oh no. How awful if that ever happens. No, that's wonderful. And that's actually not in contradiction to what Hegel aims for his society. The only issue of difference here is actually just, what do you think that means? What do you think that concretely means? Because Marx can posit a hell of a lot of things and say things in a way that seems legitimate without having the legitimacy of actual content, because the concrete forms from which we know these things haven't yet arisen. So continuing on with Olaf's comment. He quotes me complaining at him, and because he quoted me the 1844 manuscript passage that I just talked about. And I said, I know this already. It's the simplest thing to say, but not the simplest thing to really work out. Marx says it, but even by capital, it is clear he doesn't mean sublation like Hegel does. An example is precisely because he thinks communism sublates capitalism in his vision, but this meaning of sublation is not what Hegel means. And Olafsson asks, how is this clear in Capital? I can't see it anywhere. Please provide quotations. I think it's evidently clear that Marxist sublation is both preservation and transformation. Capital is preserved as a means of production. Forms and relations change, but nothing is being gotten rid of, as you put it. And that is where we deeply disagree, Olaf, because you're going to quote it later, and I'll expand on it when I get to it down the comment. That precisely when you say, quoting Olaf here, I think it is evidently clear that Marxist sublation is both preservation and transformation. That is what tells me that you aren't saying the same thing I'm saying. Sublation is not a transformation. Very clear. Sublation is not a transformation. Sublation is the unity of contradictory elements. What is sublated is unified in an organic whole. So, for example, if you have an issue between private property in feudalism, for example, the way you solve it is not by transforming the problem. The way you solve it is by just simply letting the truth be. The truth of private property appears in capitalism as opposed to feudalism. But the issue isn't, oh, we had this feudal problem of property and we're going to fix it by transforming this whole thing into capitalism. No. The issue is there's a problem of property in feudalism, and this problem finally appears as itself, for itself, as what it really is in capitalism. It doesn't appear that way in feudalism because feudalism does not have the true shape which the problem requires. There's a problem between, slave owners and slaves. And that problem is a problem of recognition and rights. That problem is a lot of problems. And you don't fix it by simply changing the concept of what it is to be human. That's not the issue. Hegel doesn't see things that way. Hegel says the concept of being human was right there from the get-go. The problem was that the shape of society did not allow that truth to come out. It didn't allow it to be as it should be, logically for itself. And so certain things at later societies show the truth of what the relations were chained in prior societies which were arbitrary. The issue which I have with communists saying that communism is going to be the sublation of capitalism is that they don't understand this. They don't understand that with capitalism, because Marx himself has made the work called capital and worked out that there is an immanent systematic genetic logic, that this is actually a proof against you, the Marxist, in believing that this will be overcome the way you think it's going to be overcome. And the problem is the way you think it's going to be overcome. Because you posit this whole system, and the system itself posits its own self. It's just the nature of private property itself playing itself out in a certain set of exchanges and commodities. And once you have that, you can go many places. For example, capital is, within Hegel's system, sublated by the state, the political state as such. And that is a real sublation in that capital is made a part of an entire systematic whole of life. Further, capital sublates itself entirely through its own systematic efforts in going beyond itself and then bringing itself back to itself. And so there's different levels of sublation. The only sublation that leads to what you claim about a transformation of life into communism is actually the technological thesis that Marx has, that technology will eventually undo capital itself, both through the class struggle as well as the technological developments which will bring out superproduction and will therefore make capitalism just plain impossible. In the same way that, once you've learned certain things and you're capable of doing certain things, doing it the old way is just simply stupid. It's just not wise. Once you have a certain way of advanced farming, why would you go back to farming like, the very first farmers? It doesn't make any sense. And so communism is a relation which looks to Marxists to be this way towards capitalism, but it only works that way in the relationship of the technological thesis. I don't think the social thesis actually works. I don't see how having the workers struggle against the capitalists is ever actually going to logically lead to what you think it does. For example, the social sublation of the alienation between boss and worker can easily be subsumed, sublated by something called a cooperative enterprise, in which the whole workers' force owns the business and is collectively the capitalist. And this has no contradiction, zero, for capitalism. Capitalism doesn't care. Capital doesn't care about that. It works. And it works just as well, and if not better, in certain scenarios than others. Capital is actually very versatile. A lot of things which communists push for can actually be realized under capital. And the question is, are you going to wait to try to push for the whole deal of the technological thesis and the marriage to the social thesis, or can you actually realize that certain things are possible now? And of course, that's a big problem with leftists, in which they don't want to admit that certain things are possible now. They want the whole thing, they want the whole cake immediately. But I think history shows us that that doesn't really happen. So, continuing, Olaf quotes me. For Hegel, sublation is the intake and mediation of all lower elements, meaning that what sublates capital does not get rid of capital. It merely limits its role in a whole. Marx here means sublation along what happens in the philosophy of history, where there is the easy to make mistake of what seems like progressive improvement by correcting the logical mistake of a form, a learning by necessity of error and correcting it by changing the process that produces the error. And let me just expand on what I mean by that, Olaf. I said it earlier about the whole issue of, if you compare the transition between feudalism to capital, people like you and people like Marx and people like Marxists assume that this sort of transitional movement is going to be the same to communism, and it's not. Because unlike the movement to capital, in which the appearance of private property and this whole economic production finally appears for itself, it was imminent already in feudalism with the whole guild system and whatnot, and other things. But it wasn't allowed to actually play itself out freely. And once that is unleashed from feudal relations, the truth of private property, the truth of rights, the truth of all these other things starts to appear for itself without the shackles of feudalism. But when you look at capital, what are the shackles of capital? The shackles of capital are its own shackles in which we take capital to be absolute. When we realize that capital is not absolute as a society, where does that leave us? Well, it doesn't leave us with communism immediately. Like I was saying earlier, you can go to the state. You suddenly realize, oh, look, we can have this thing called social democracy. As a matter of fact, we can have even something better. But I'll mention that for other things. One of the philosophers that I like is Hegelian, Richard Dean Winfield, has a pretty good take on these things. A lot of people would look at them and it's like, well, isn't this guy just a sock dem? Not quite. He goes quite a bit further than just sock dems. I would go as far as say that Winfield is like so radical that you would need a revolution to implement the shit that he advocates. But he's not a revolutionary. He's not a Marxist. And so to get to capitalism from feudalism, as I was saying, it's not a correction of error. It's not that, oh, we had the wrong idea of certain things. It's simply you finally let the true things be, and they will develop themselves, and you just let the false things fall away. And capital has a lot less of that than you think. And Olaf's response to me says, again, capital is not gotten rid of in any simple way. Let me quote you this. And he's quoting Marx here. Quote, the capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of the proprietor. And this is, I'm going to say it, I think, bullshit, because Marx is using his own idiosyncratic notions, his own idiosyncratic conception of what private property and property are. The capitalist mode of production produces capitalist private property. And when Marx is talking about private property, he's talking about the means of production. And he's talking about not means of production as such, he's talking about the big, general social means of production, factories, the big means production. And he says, this is the first negation of individual private property as founded on the labor of the proprietor. And this is bullshit, because this is the Lockean myth in which, property arose because we mixed our labor with certain things. That's not true. That doesn't really happen. The basis of property is actually nothing. Let me tell you that. There is no basis for property other than that we all accept that somebody owns property. That's it. If you mix your labor with the land, sorry, if I don't recognize it as property, it ain't property. If society doesn't recognize it as property, it ain't property. If you say God gave it to you, if society doesn't recognize it as property, it ain't property. Property is what society recognizes as property for whatever reasons society gives for recognizing property. Ultimately, it's all recognition. There is no prior basis for private property at all. And this distinction between private and personal property is complete bullshit. It's a fictitious distinction that if you really work it out, and I had this thing that I was writing years ago, going over how fictitious this distinction is, and I just never finished it, but I had a good argument going for that, about why it doesn't make sense. Marx posits distinction, the leftists posit this distinction, but there is no distinction between private property and property as such. All property is private property. What else does it mean? Property is exclusion of something or from someone else. You're saying, I have these claims, and the I doesn't have to be you, the individual. It can be you, a group. It can be you, a state. The reason to claim property is precisely to set down limitations on certain rules, on certain uses of certain things. Even public property, has limitations in which, yes, everybody, quote unquote, owns it. But the reason everybody owns it is precisely set out a full set of determinations of how this is to be used and what limits we have in using it and who can use it. Such things that are public property in the United States are not things that, if you're from Germany, you can come here and just do whatever the fuck you want. So property is always exclusive. That's its nature. Sorry, just checking to see if there's messages. So, let me reread what Marx says, starting again. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property as founded on the labor of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets with the inexorability of a law of nature its own negation. It is a negation of the negation. This doesn't re-establish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property based on the acquisition of the capitalist era, that is, on cooperation in the possession in common of the land and of the means of production. And as I was just saying, this is a fictitious distinction. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property based on the acquisition of the capitalist era. Yeah, because it establishes private property on a group level, communal level, in which that's subdivided to the individual, but it's still private property regardless of what it is. Regardless of what group, regardless of how many people, regardless of how many individuals, it's still private property. And so yes, private property is returned. Now you, the individual, actually have a say in the community production. You actually have a say on what the factory will run like, what it will do, all these other things, which you don't have right now. And that is a difference. And I think that is a sublative difference. So, here Marx is right, but he's right for the wrong reasons. He has the wrong conception of private property, and he has the wrong conception of what this means, that this has to mean communism. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. You can have cooperatives. That is itself a sublation of this very distinction between private property of the capitalist and private property of the individual worker. And so that's one of the ways in which you can see that Marx is not right to claim the things he does, that it does not inexorably lead to communism. Although, the logic does inexorably lead to the eventual merger between the difference of capitalist and worker. And then Olaf quotes me and says, property divides us and seizes its alienation, let me begin that again. quoting myself, property divides us and seizes its alienation when we do not. Maybe he misquoted me, or I wrote terribly. Sorry about that. Property divides us, and to seize its alienation does not get rid of property. Instead, we find that we keep it as an individuating reality that is seen, lived, and comprehended as not an absolute division and basis for our social world. And Olaf comments, Marx never speaks of getting rid of property. I'm very surprised that any Marxist former or not would make this mistake. Please clarify. Well, I think I've clarified now that I don't know if I insinuated that Marx meant that we got rid of all property. If I did, then I misspoke, because I know that's not true. So, if I said that, point taken. But what Marx means by property, definitely we are in contention of that. And the reason I said what he quoted me, which is I said property divides us, and to seize its alienation does not get rid of property. I was talking about that whole private property and personal property distinction, in which to seize the alienation of private property is not going to get rid of private property. And I mean that both in the Marxist sense as well as in the Hegelian sense. It just doesn't make any sense, really. And to just make some expansions on that, actually. Bad boy, Junior, be a good boy. To make some expansions on that. The issue I have is with this idea that we're going to get rid of private property in the Marxist sense. Is that I don't think everything is up to communal decision when it comes to production. I think that something like markets, for example, is extremely useful for a lot of things. I'm of the opinion here that if we really want a free society, I don't think you should limit that. There's a certain point in which we can talk about necessities of life, and we can talk about frivolities. We can talk about luxuries. And I don't think we should superproduce luxuries. I think that's a mode of thinking that comes with certain assumptions about the world of resources. And here, I'm taking some inspiration from Chad Haig from the Chad African channel. You should check him out. Who definitely has big issues with this. Chad focuses a lot about the issues of technological limitations, especially the limitations of peak oil. If we don't actually find anything that can replace the efficacy of oil as a cheap and easy to use energy resource, when you have to take limitations of resources in mind, this idea of, oh, well, just super produce everything and, everything will be hunky-dory does not work. This whole idea does not work at all. And so, what are we going to super produce? Well, we're going to super produce things that we all need. We're going to super produce food. We're going to super produce housing. We're going to do all these things that everybody needs, in which, we're going to put resources specifically for that. But stuff like frivolous luxuries, video games, television shows, all these other things. Why would we put all resources towards that? Those things are limited, and those things are things which are posited both for like social reasons as well as just plainly, people just like shit. And I think it's just perfectly fine to leave an open market for those kinds of things, in which, if you want to make a fucking console, video game console, or you want to make something that's, relatively limited to a certain niche audience, why should you have to have a co-op? Why should you have to have all these other things? You can run a business in the usual way, and if people want to get into it, sure, and if people don't. I think certainly people should have options, not to be forced like they are now to get into those situations. But if you're interested in certain things like that, you can, and you can try your hands at it, and maybe you blow up, and maybe you become, filthy rich. Maybe we'll tax the shit out of you. But you'll have that opportunity to work in those certain ways within the market. So I don't see a reason to get rid of private property, so to say. And sorry, my dog is being a bad boy. Get over here. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. Sorry about that. But not to keep rambling. Sorry. Uh, I'm at the end of his comments, and I told Olaf this, and for those of you watching, keep this in mind too. Quoting myself here, don't quote texts at me. At least give me an argument, because indeed this will go nowhere otherwise. And Olaf says, I will keep on doing both, as claims as to what Marx believes is exactly what we are discussing here. Well, maybe that's what you're discussing, but I don't really give a fuck. I don't care what Marx believes. I don't care what Hegel believes. I don't care what anybody believes. Rather, I'm more interested in the logic of what they do, in the logic of their text. Because people say a lot of things, and you all ought to know this, which seem one way in certain contexts. And what really matters is the actions. What really matters is, where does the logical argument actually go? You know, where do they actually end? Where do they meander? And so I'm far more interested in that than playing these exegetical games of, did my holy man, did my did my my saint, did my philosophical, I don't know, idol say what I accept and what I think is acceptable? I don't give a shit. But what I mean by don't quote shit at me is, please make an argument. You know, if you tell me, well, that's not what Marx means by alienation, well, great. The argument was really from my side that Marx does not mean alienation in the Hegelian sense. And if you want to make the argument that Marx does mean alienation in the Hegelian sense, it's up to you to prove that to me through an argument and not through quoting text, because I can actually explain to you exactly what I mean. And you haven't done that. You know, you have to show, because it's easy. It's easy to quote a text that looks like it says the right things, that looks like it has the right structure. But, you know, that's just an abstract. You know, if you actually look into the details of what later gets worked out by a lot of people, particularly Marx, you find out that no, it doesn't actually work the way you think it works. It's not what you think it is. And so, yes, there are very big differences between the Marxist idea of logic, the Marxist idea, and the Hegelian idea of logic. And therefore, there are differences between Marx's concept of alienation and Hegel's concept of alienation, and how those two things, you know, actually interplay, and how all the dynamics interplay. You know, the understanding of the philosophy of history by Marxists, for example, is, I think, completely erroneous when they try to read Hegel through a Marxist lens. Earlier, Olaf mentioned that obviously, you know, Hegel sees ideas, you know, the dialectics happening in ideas before they happen in reality, and Marx is the one who sees that they happen in material reality before ideas. That is complete and total bullshit. And that's one of the things that tells you that this person has not actually read Hegel very well, because it's easy to just read. It's easy to take a commentary by somebody and go along with it. It's easy for you to go along with your preconceptions and read things into a text that aren't actually there. Because I can tell you that everything that I've read from Hegel does not speak to the truth of that at all. Everything that I've read from Hegel tells me that Hegel actually does believe that this whole material life of ours is contradictory, is dialectical, is full of alienation, is full of problems, and that these problems have their own genesis in these wider problems, both human, both transhistorical social, both specifically historical and social, and that they will work themselves out in very specific ways. And it's not just in your head. You know, the problems of capital, the problems of communism, the problem of any society are solved on the level of that society's own mode of life. You know, the problems of politics are not solved in an argument in your head, and they don't arise as an argument in your head. You know, the complexity of, say, the United States stupid political system of, you know, how do we elect people, how those elected people, you know, actually go about the business, is absolutely something that nobody had dreamed of before, until the mess that it is now. But the mess that it is now is going to be solved through the mess that it is now. You know, it's not going to be solved by other people speculating at other times in other places. And so this idea that, oh, Hegel is, you know, somewhere out there thinking that we're all pre-thinking reality, and then we go and look at reality and say, oh, yeah, you know, I see the dialectic there. No, you know, we get the material for thought from the actual lives we live, from this social world we already inhabit. Ideas for Hegel are not things in your head. Ideas are the very reality you live. You live in a state, the state is an idea. You live in an economy, the economy is an idea. You live in a school system, the school system is an idea. All these things, these social realities, as well as personal realities of the ontological kind, are ideas. They're just a fact of the way we are and we live. And so this idea that this materialist idealist divide is complete total bullshit. Marx is wrong about it, and I will take that to the grave. You can quote to me the End of Capital, which says Marx says, my method is the complete opposite of Hegel's. I've turned him on his head. Bullshit. RDOR 011 says Marxist conception of private property refers to the means of production because it ties with the wage labor exploitation. Yes, I know that. I've read the 1844 manuscripts. It's a bullshit conception. It's arbitrary. It has no basis other than Marx's own biases, and that's why I don't buy it. Sure, if you take Marx's premises, yes, it does make sense. Not going to deny that. But if you don't, and if you actually try to build a other systematic view from it, you find that it doesn't actually work. If you try to pretend that that somehow compares to how Hegel derives the concept of property, it's not even a comparison. Hegel has far better ground and far better reasons for saying the things he does about property than Marx does. Marx's obsession with labor blinds him to a lot of things. It's something that is worth focusing on, absolutely. I'm not saying that Marx was wrong to put labor in focus for a moment, but to make that as absolute as Marx does is erroneous. To make the idea that technology is all there is to it, that once we just reach a certain technological point with capitalism, capitalism is going to undo itself, which is, I'm not saying Marx believes this. I'm saying Marxists, and I know plenty who do believe this, who are idiots. That's not true. That's not going to happen. Meh says, from what I understood, Marx sees that private property is a necessary consequence of alienated labor. Yes. As a matter of fact, Marx says that alienated labor is private property. And if you check out my channel, Left of Wreckage, on YouTube, I have some readings about me reading about estranged labor. Not reading about, but reading the exact passages from the entire essays from the 1844 manuscripts about that. And yes, what Marx says makes sense in the context of what he says, but it doesn't make sense when you try to, actually take this as an objective theory. Lieslin says, have you read Society of Spectacle? The board was influenced by Hegel. No, I have not. My friend Hyperion has, though. He said it wasn't that great, but it was Hegelian. He said it was indeed Hegelian. I actually just found it more interesting to maybe I'm wrong because I haven't read it. But I would think that, say, something like Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man is, and Adorno's The Culture Industry would probably be a far clearer and far better comprehension than the Society of the Spectacle. Would I get some interesting stuff out of it, given my understanding of Hegel? Probably. I mean, honestly, I get interesting stuff from just about everything. I mean, I've been reading stuff like mystics, like Edgar Cayce, for example, and I see a ton of Hegel in those things, and in very interesting ways, actually. It's made me think. It's made me think. Speaking of Adorno, have you read about negative dialectics? I have read about negative dialectics. I have not read negative dialectics. It's on my to-read list eventually. Although, given what I've read about what Adorno says, um, I doubt I will agree. I doubt I will agree with the fundamental conclusions that Adorno draws from that, because I don't think he understands Hegel's dialectic really. Um, that if you think that all that dialectic is precisely the dialectic, the moment of, sundering, of diremption, in which you just have this absolute contradiction. And Adorno is indeed, unlike Marx, a believer that the only solution is that the whole thing is going to break apart and undo itself. Whereas, Marx still believes in sublation in some manner, even though, as this whole video has gone on, my claim is that Marx does not understand sublation the way that Hegel does. And if you're interested in me reading some of the Frankfurt School, you can check out my other channel, Left of Wreckage. And I have some readings of I think 2 chapters of One-Dimensional Man, which were interesting. I mean, honestly, at the point at which, like, if you understand Hegel, everybody else seems honestly rather shallow. Like, you read them at the beginning, you're like, wow, that's amazing. And then you read it after you've read Hegel, and you're like, yeah, yeah, that's true, but I already had that in mind. I read Benjamin not too long ago, actually. Well, I was reading about Benjamin. I wasn't reading Benjamin directly. It was about Benjamin's dialectical images. And there's another guy who also did not understand Hegel. But the interesting thing is that Benjamin's attempt to go against the Hegelian grain struck me as being rather Hegelian with his dialectical images, because while they were things that were supposed to be non-conceptual and supposed to strike you aesthetically and awaken you, so to say, to the reality of a contradiction and the desire to just, like the Adornian negative dialectic, desire to just stop the gears of the machine, at all cost. Nonetheless, the way his whole dialectical imagination images worked was exactly the Hegelian concept. Which is partly why you would understand that he hates it, but it's funny that he couldn't get out of it. Am I done with Fichte? No, I'm not done with Fichte. It's just Fichte is just kind of like one of those things that I go back to every once in a while. I'd like to make some videos, but I don't know about you. Like, if you go and try to read the Wissenschaftler, which is the original Science of Knowledge, I think I have the 2nd edition. That is some of the most difficult shit you will ever read. I mean, people say Hegel is hard. People say maybe Heidegger is hard and this other shit. Like, Fichte is a special kind of hard, because you have to love torture to like Fichte's way of writing. It is it's autistic in the best kind of way. It is it's a mess, and it's so analogical, and it's full of these weird things that are like symbolic equations and whatnot. And you're like, what the fuck is he talking about? But you got to really slow down and look at every little detail, and then eventually you'll figure it out. But it's funny that the translator to that edition also mentions about how he's like, I don't know how anybody like he was like, I'm pretty sure there's something here of value to whoever can actually work through it, but he's like, I'm not sure what. Not only that, if you read the actually, you should read the introductions to the Wissenschaftler, the Science of Knowledge, the first and the second introduction, because, man, Fichte is vicious. Like, he's the kind of guy that I love. he is so full. He is so full of himself in the proper ways that he just like wrecks everybody else in his commentaries. Like there's something in the second introduction, well, the second preface, in which like he basically like on the down low calls the people who are against him, and he questions whether they have a whether they're not mentally challenged, let's just say. Luke Fontes asks, have you read Lukács? What do you think of his use of the term dialectical materialism? Is it better than the others who use them? I have not read Lukács. I've had his whole thing. I have a friend of mine who really likes him and keeps telling me to read him. And as far as I know, Lukács definitely has a way better understanding than most Marxists when it comes to Hegel. Not sure whether he fully comprehends Hegel. Well, I doubt it, because Marxists have their own certain bias in which it's just very hard to get out of that. If you're either a Marxist, you're a Hegelian. And since he wasn't a Hegelian, I'm pretty sure he didn't quite get what the whole Hegelian thing was. But I've heard very good things about Lukács. I think I want to read, what was it called? History and Class Consciousness. But I also want to read even more so his response to the response which History and the Class Consciousness got in the Soviet Union. It's something entaillism. That's what I remember it being called. And it wasn't available in English until very recently. Oh, a word on Fichte and Marx, by the way. There's a book I have, and I think it's verbatim called Marx and Fichte, and it talks about how Marx's own philosophy generally compares to Fichte's philosophy. And if you read that book, I'll be damned if you don't come to the agreement that I have come to, which is that Marx is actually closer to Fichte than he is to Hegel, by far. Because the way Fichte thinks about things is very, very close to how Marx thinks about things. Fichte is all about activity, and Fichte is all about striving. Fichte is all about the fact that you'll never get to the perfection, but you'll get closer and closer and closer. And there's just fundamental affinities there that aren't there with Marx and Hegel. And the question is, did Marx read Fichte? And surely he must have read something by Fichte, because Fichte was a big name back then, and in undergrad he must have had to read him to some extent. But whether Marx realized how close he was to Fichte, probably not. Which is funny, because Fichte is even more hated than Hegel, as a subjective idealist. But if you look at what Fichte says, like, oh my God, Fichte is like Fichte is so close to like Marxist materialism. It's almost funny. It's almost funny in his focus. And Fichte was way, way more radical than Hegel. Like, read about the things he was doing in his life, and you can understand why Fichte got fired from Jena. There's so many things. Like Fichte wanted communism. Like, no joke. Like, and people are like, but wasn't Fichte a nationalist? Go read about it. His nationalism was for a purpose. I mean, it's like how the USSR came about, and how there was a focus on building up the USSR. And some people say, like, oh, isn't that nationalism? Like that Stalin, didn't go and immediately invade all the countries and turn them socialist. Fichte had sort of idea of which, like, yeah, you're supposed to build up your own nation, and once you kind of have things going, in the meantime, you help spread the word, and the revolution spreads eventually. And Fichte had no fear whatsoever of spilling blood for a righteous cause. But anyways, this has gone on tangents. Lieslin, I'm actually coming to Hegel through Max Stirner. You're probably the second person that I've met that has said that, Lieslin. Or is it Yithlin? I don't know. I can't tell if that's an L or an I. There's somebody else I know who also has come to Hegel from a Max Stirner perspective. Can't say they quite get Hegel, but doesn't matter. You know, anybody who wants to learn the dialectic is going to find it a bit of a challenge. But I think that the more you work through it, the more you recognize things in it. I mean, it becomes so mundane after a certain point. But anyways, any further questions, comments? It's all the way back there. All right, well, anyways, I don't think this will satisfy Mr. Olafsson in my response. And if he desires some clarifications further, they'll be made in the comments section. But suffice to say, yes, there are differences between Marx and Hegel on a purely philosophical level and a purely logical level, in which once we start talking about certain things, they just don't mean the same thing. And I'm a strong believer, just like Spinoza. Spinoza somewhere says, I think it's the Tractatus Theological Politicus, I think, where Spinoza says, you know, all the disagreements we have is because we use the same words, but we mean different things. And I think that is absolutely true. You know, just because you say alienation, I say alienation, does not mean we're talking about the same thing. And even when things look very similar, the truth of the matter is we're not talking about the same thing. You know, it's like, it would be like me mistaking going and reading Casey and going, oh my God, Casey's Hegelian. And I'm talking about Edgar Cayce here. And the truth of the matter is, of course he's not. You look at the rest of the stuff that Casey talks about, there is a lot of difference. And the things that seem similar are not that similar in the end. So, with all due respect, Mr. Olafsson, I think we were talking past each other, and I think we'll just keep talking past each other for the most part. The difference is, I think I understand that we're talking past each other. Maybe you'll realize that too. But anyways, this has been Antonio Wolf.